Hello, my name is Emilye Crosby. I'm a professor of history at the State University of New York at Geneseo. I wrote my first book, A Little Taste of Freedom, The Black Freedom Struggle in Claiborne County, Mississippi, about my home community, which is what got me interested in studying and teaching the freedom struggle. I particularly enjoy working with the SNCC Legacy Project and the Movement History Initiative. I'm here with Judy Richardson. Judy is a filmmaker and educator. She worked on all 14 hours of Eyes on the Prize and is co-editor of the SNCC Women's Anthology, Hands on the Freedom Plow, Personal Accounts by Women in SNCC. She was a visiting professor at Brown University and co-directed 2 NEH Teacher Institutes. All of her work is grounded in her experiences as a staff worker with SNCC in Mississippi, Alabama, Southwest Georgia, and the national office in Atlanta. Hasan Kwame Jeffries is an associate professor of history at The Ohio State University, the author of Bloody Lounge, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt, and the editor of Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement. He was the host of the Teaching Hard History podcast and is a member of the SNCC Legacy Project Board. Christina Thomas is a civil rights scholar and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Civil Rights History and Research. Her research primarily focuses on the history of civil rights, education, and Black women's activism in Mississippi. She also serves as a community archivist for the Freedom Information Service Library in Jackson, Mississippi. And we're here tonight to talk about labor and grassroots organizing in relation to SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as ongoing efforts to document and share that history. And we're going to start with our sort of quick SNCC in 4 minutes by Judy Richardson.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Emily. Okay, so I'm going to do this very quickly and I have my notes because otherwise SNCC in 4 minutes becomes SNCC in 40 minutes and we don't have the time. So let me start. SNCC was the only organization in the Southern movement that was founded and led by young people. And SNCC was founded in April 1960 by activists from the student sit-in movement, a movement that mushroomed throughout the South after that Greensboro, North Carolina sit-in in February 1960. And that movement was grounded in the activism of Black students at HBCUs. These students were then brought together by the legendary strategist and organizer, Ella Baker, at her alma mater, Shaw University in North Carolina. So Diane Nash, John Lewis, Marion Barry, they all come into that meeting from the Nashville student movement. Julian Bond and others represent the Atlanta student movement. Now, Ms. Baker, whom you see here in 1964, had a long history of organizing. She'd organized food co-ops in Harlem in 1940. She had been director of branches for the NAACP, building strong local branches throughout the South. In fact, she stayed with Mrs. Rosa Parks before and after the Montgomery bus boycott. And she was the first executive secretary of Dr. King's SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization that he and other progressive Black ministers formed after the Montgomery bus boycott. But back to the student meeting in April 1960. So at that first meeting that Ms. Baker called, she cautioned the students to think beyond the sit-ins, beyond integration, that the struggle had to be, as she said, bigger than a hamburger. It had to deal with whether people could afford the hamburger. And so SNCC was always focused on economic justice. And Ms. Baker was SNCC's political mentor, grounding the organization in the idea of building bottom-up grassroots leadership, moving away from focusing mainly on demonstrations to focusing instead on effective long-term organizing. And by the way, that's a photo of me on the right just before we all got arrested at the Tuttle House sit-in chain, the Tuttle House restaurant chain in Atlanta in 1964. You would see John Lewis's head just above mine. I'm the one in the middle staring vacantly into space. Okay, so to continue. SNCC soon became an organization of full-time youth organizers, working in rural Mississippi, Alabama, Southwest Georgia, and Arkansas. And we lived in the communities where we organized, often guided and guarded by local adult leaders. The primary issues were voting rights, basically, how do you get Black people registered to vote without getting them killed, and economic justice. So SNCC was the driving force behind the continuation of the 1961 Freedom Rides through Diane Nash's leadership, as well as 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer, which included the founding of freedom schools and free health clinics and a bunch of other stuff, and a voting rights campaign energized by the formation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And many remember the speech by the MFDP's Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer at the Democratic Party convention in Atlantic City that year, 1964, where she says, "I question America." So SNCC chairs have included Marion Barry, later four-time mayor of Washington, D.C., and John Lewis, later a U.S. congressman, often called the conscience of the Congress, and Stokely Carmichael, later named Kwame Ture. And in 1966, Stokely and other SNCC organizers began working with local leaders in Lowndes County, Alabama, which was a county called Bloody Lowndes because of the rampant racial violence, and Hasan will talk more about that, to organize an independent Black political party with the Black Panther as its logo. And Stokely had just been elected SNCC chair in 1966 when he raised the cry for Black power on a Mississippi voting rights march. And that slogan was not something new, right? It reflected a fundamental concept that had long grounded SNCC's organizing. So, SNCC was always grounded by the concepts Ms. Baker spoke about at a 1964 Mississippi mass meeting. At that point, she said, quote, "Even if segregation is gone, we will still have to see that everyone has a job." And by the way, she's not just talking about Black people. She's talking about everybody who needs to have a job, right? And even if we can all vote, if people are still hungry, we will not be free. Singing alone is not enough. We need schools and learning. And Ms. Baker says this in a speech at a mass meeting in Hattiesburg, Mississippi in 1964. So let me turn it now back over to you, Emilye, and we can take me off the screen.
Thanks for sharing that introduction to SNCC's history. And we're going to get into more detail about SNCC. Hasan, can you tell us about SNCC's approach to organizing, what we mean by the term grassroots organizing, and why did SNCC take this approach?
Yeah, well, certainly. Thank you, Emily. And building off of what Judy shared, SNCC's approach to organizing was really grounded in the approach to organizing, very much refined, practiced, and established by veteran organizer Ella Baker. It was about empowering local people. It was focused on ordinary, everyday people on the ground. And it was guided by the belief that everyday people have the ability, have the knowledge, have the wherewithal, have the determination to shape and have a say in the decisions that affected their lives. And so there are many approaches to creating change in any social movement, just in life in general. But what was so unique about SNCC's approach was its focus on everyday people. So often, when thinking about the Black freedom struggle in this particular instance, but really any social movement, the emphasis is often on those who are elite, the professional class, the those with formal training and education. But what was so unique about SNCC is they said, formal education, college degrees, professional training were not necessarily prerequisites for not just only participating and making decisions, but for leadership within the movement itself. And so it was really SNCC's approach, when talking about grassroots organizing, was really rooted in empowering everyday people. And to me, that's one of the things that really stands out about SNCC's approach to change.
I think most people, when they think about the civil rights movement, they think about the big events that, the sit-ins, marches, mass demonstrations. But that was really, SNCC got its start out of the sit-in movement, but that was really only one small part of what SNCC was, known for and is important about SNCC. Can somebody talk more about SNCC's voter registration work and why that was so important?
Actually, Hasan, why don't you take that one? I'll add to it.
Yeah, certainly. So, scholars like Charles Payne, for example, have really made clear and drew our attention to sort of a broad distinction between grassroots organizing and grassroots mobilizing. And when we think about grassroots mobilizing, we're thinking about those large demonstrations, getting people to a particular place at a particular moment to draw attention to a particular thing. But grassroots organizing, and again, Charles Payne, we just marked the 30th anniversary of his groundbreaking book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, really laid out very clearly and succinctly that grassroots organizing involves that slow and hard work, the patient work of reaching out to people, knocking on doors, canvassing, trying to get folk, one, to listen to you, then to listen to you again, and then hopefully maybe come to a meeting. And then after they turn you down the second or third or fourth time, getting them to a meeting, and then hopefully getting them out to perhaps register to vote. I mean, that doesn't happen in a day. That doesn't happen in a week. Sometimes that doesn't happen in a month. Sometimes that's the next year of establishing these connections to get folk into the position where they're ready to take those particular risks that have the potential to transform their lives. And so when we think about grassroots organizing, we're really thinking about the ways in which SNCC organizers got people involved in this process of challenging the established powers, the established status quo, in order to in order to have a say in the decisions that affected their lives. We see that in Albany, Georgia. We see it in Greenwood, Mississippi. We see it in Lowndes County, Alabama. And it's connected to the mobilizing, right? Like we often we look at it backwards, right? We look at mobilizing as though that's the beginning and the end, rather than looking at mobilizing events, even marches and demonstrations, and saying, okay, if not for organizing, you don't have the mobilizing event. And then what happens after the mobilizing event? So we saw, I'll just add this briefly, we saw, for example, whether we're talking about the Selma to Montgomery March or the Meredith March, that here we have a mobilizing event. But what SNCC activists did is they transformed that mobilizing event into an organizing opportunity, building upon connections and personal connections that existed before, creating new connections during the mobilizing event, and then reconnecting with the members of the community afterward to build something that's much more lasting.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to that more with how SNCC built on the Selma to Montgomery March to launch some of their organizing in Lowndes County. But Judy, do you want to build on that now?
Yeah, because it reminds me, I mean, when I'm listening to Hasan talk, it reminds me of a story that Amzie Moore, the leader, one of the major leaders in Mississippi, talked about. And um, I didn't know. Well, let me just say, it was when we were in the midst of production for Eyes on the Prize, and I think it was the second series, and I had just dropped Bob Moses, Nick's main first organizer in Mississippi. I just dropped him off at his house after he had done a scholar meeting with the producers, and so I said, Bob, I don't remember a lot of this stuff, and he said, well, I don't either. And then he proceeded, while I'm standing outside his house, to talked about this for the next 45 minutes, which I won't go into for 45 minutes. But he said, when I first went into Mississippi, I was trying to figure out whom do I contact. And he said, Miss Baker, who was, of course, our main guiding light here. She said, well, if you want to do anything in Mississippi, you need to contact Amzie Moore. And so he contacts Amzie. Now, so Amzie, he gets to Amzie's house, and of course, um, he has already contacted him so Amzie is expecting him. But the reason that Amzie is so welcoming is because Bob goes with Miss Baker's imprimatur. I mean, basically, Miss Baker has put her hands on him. So Amzie knows Bob is okay. So for the next 6 weeks, Amzie and his family clothe, house, feed Bob, right? But Bob says to me on the street corner, right? He says, so when I get to Amzie's house, though, I'm talking about what we're thinking we're doing, and at that point, most of what SNCC is doing is demonstrations. He said at one point, Amzie, they're sitting, of course, around the kitchen table in Amzie's house in Cleveland, Mississippi, and Amzie opens a precinct map. And again, I'm getting this story from Bob. And he says he opens his precinct map and he says, look, this is where Black folks are gathered. This is where they're in the majority. And he goes all through the Delta. This is where people are. But then he says, uh, you know, you young people can talk about demonstrations if you want to. But, says Amzie Moore in 1962, what I know is that our power as Black people will come through the vote. And so he says, so we need to work on where we are in the, at least in good numbers. But then he says to Bob, but I'm not ready for you here in terms of my organization here in Cleveland, Mississippi. It's not ready for you for what we need to do. But CC Bryant is ready for you down in Southwest Mississippi. And the reason he knows about CC Bryant and others is because all of them are part of something called the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, the RCNL. And this is an organization that I first heard from Amzie when I was doing an interview with him for Eyes on the Prize back in 1979, right? And thought he was crazy. Because Amzie in this interview says, back in 79, he says, yeah, you know, we had this organization and we brought together, you know, about 15,000 Black people in Mount Bayou, Mississippi, the all Black town in Mississippi. And I'm thinking when I'm doing the interview, oh, poor Amzie, you know, something, he probably a little demented, you know, because how on earth could he get 15,000 Black people in Mississippi, knowing what I knew about what we were going through in 61, 62. And he's talking about, you know, 1950, 51, 52. So, but now Bob is confirming this. He says, yeah, Amzie said, go see CC Bryant. And these the Regional Council of Negro Leadership were these returning World War II veterans. And they come back from World War II, and they say, we don't have to take this, you know, let us start organizing. So they organize this group, and it's Medgar Evers, it's CC Bryant, it's all these people. And they're talking about getting fair bank loans. They're trying to get fair distribution of crops and farm loans, talking about voting. They're talking about getting Black teachers equal salaries to white teachers. So all of that is part of this Regional Council of the Negro Leadership. So they're doing this in Mississippi. Mr. and Mrs. Boynton, Emilye Boynton and her husband, they're doing it in Alabama with the Voting Rights League, you know, the Voters League in Alabama. So there were people that we were able to build on because even though some of these folks didn't know whether, you know, anything would come of it in their lifetime, at least they knew we got to do something and we're going to do this, right? And so when we come in, we, SNCC, are able to build on that.
That's such an important part of the history that I think many people don't really know about. You know, they're getting the big events and they're not getting this behind the scenes picture. Christina, can you talk about some of the people in Mississippi that SNCC worked with?
Yes, and you know, running off of Judy's point as well and talking about, I particularly think about Charles McLaurin's note on organizing, of where he's offering blueprint of, you know, how to, you know, find a family to stay with. And then when you find that family, what do you do next? You go out into the community, you make these relations. And like Hasan was saying too, it's not something that happens overnight with building and cultivating these relationships, because there is a deep fear and mistrust. I think it's Sam Block who talks about, you know, people going across the street, not even walking on the same part of the street as him because they didn't want to be associated with those freedom riders or those SNCC folks as well. But I think about too, when you were talking about the World War II veterans, you know, fighting this war overseas, but then coming back and fighting this war on the home front as well. Thinking about women like Winston Hudson, you know, who even before in the late 1930s, she's attempting to register to vote. And I love, you know, the stories her family share, you know, in a red dress, that she's going to the courthouse in a red dress to be seen, to be shown with no fear. But what SNCC offers, you know, women like Winston Hudson, women like Fannie Lou Hamer in particular, too, is that, you know, you have the movement coming in, you have these young organizers coming in, you have this grassroots tradition that says everyone can be a leader, because to gain freedom requires the full participation of everyone. And so I think of the story of Winston Hudson in 1964 in Lee County, when the Freedom Summer Volunteers are coming in and they're going to meet them, and the sheriff kind of puts himself in between and says, "Who invited you here?" And she goes, "Well, we did." You know, in that moment, staring the sheriff down and saying, you know, "We invited them here. We're welcoming them here. They're tapping into this network. We're housing them. We're protecting them with guns too, as well." So those are some of the people I think about when we think about the history of the movement. And I think that's the beauty of SNCC too, and that's the beauty of teaching about SNCC, are these people who aren't normally named or not normally showcased or honored in the same way that a lot of people were on the ground organizing, even if we don't know their names.
I think I'm so glad you brought that up. I think that's one of the most important things about SNCC is its openness to participation and leadership from everyone. And, following Miss Baker's guidance, Miss Baker's ideas, that everybody has potential, and that part of what this movement is about is developing that potential. And I know that one of the SNCC organizers, I think it was MacArthur Cotton, said, it wasn't even so much that SNCC developed leaders, but it got rid of the barriers for the leaders that were already there. And I think that that's one of the reasons why there were so many women who participated in SNCC, both the young women who were part of the organization and then the older women in the communities like Miss Hudson or Miss Hamer. SNCC didn't just rule them out because they're older, because they're female, because they're poorly educated in a formal education sense. And SNCC was really open to whoever was going to bring it, right? And a lot of the people who brought it were people that had been dismissed and ignored previous to that. Another thing that I've heard a lot of people talk about is fear, right? And I know that Charles Payne, in his book, he says, there was no reason for people to think that the movement was going to be successful when SNCC comes into the Mississippi Delta in early 60s. And one of the things that SNCC did was really challenge white supremacy and model that. And of course, they wouldn't have been able to do it if there weren't local people that were also protecting and providing that space. But do you all have any favorite stories about how SNCC and local people challenged that fear and carved out this space for organizing?
Yeah, one incident that comes to mind involves Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael at the time, when they first began to organize and enter into Lowndes County, Alabama. So this is after the Selma to Montgomery March had occurred. A small group, Judy would know, could speak to this, testify to this, of four head back into the county. And then there's this incident where they're trying to pass out leaflets announcing a mass meeting to be held by the newly formed Lowndes County Christian Movement for Human Rights. It's just a few weeks old. And there someone comes up with the idea, and this is also drawing upon lessons learned in Mississippi, like, hey, if we want to get the word out, let's take these flyers over to the segregated black high school, Lowndes County Training School, and we'll hand out the flyers to the students as they're leaving for the day, and they'll take them home and they'll spread around the county. And so they show up in front of the county, in front of the school, and they begin to hand out these leaflets. And unbeknownst to them at the time, but it was discovered later that the black principal, who was, really in the pocket of the all white school board, calls the county sheriff. Calls the deputies and says, we got some folk here that could create some trouble. I didn't invite them. He's trying to protect his own interests here, his own selfish interests, and not necessarily the interests of the students. And then the police show up. And then there's this remarkable. We know about this account because there's a transcript of a conversation that Stokely Carmichael has a couple months later, recounting this story. Is recorded, and the recording is lost, but the transcript is there, and it's him and George Green. Is having this. He's sort of interviewing him as they're driving back because they ain't got nothing else to do on the way to Atlanta. And he's like, "So what happened?" And Carmichael makes a point. He says, "Listen, in any movement, especially early on, there comes this moment when you have to challenge power, right? You have to challenge authority, and usually it's the form of the police. And the community is watching. He said all these kids were watching. The police show up, they roll up, and all these black kids, young black kids who are coming out of school are watching. What's this interaction? And the police are like, y'all gotta go. And Carmichael was like, we don't have to go anywhere, right? Like we have a right to be here. We're not doing anything, right? Did anything wrong, so we're not going anywhere. And that shook, the police officers, the deputy sheriffs are like, well, okay, hold on, wait, let's pull back over here and figure out what's going on. We ain't used to Negroes talking to us like that. And you have all the brothers and sisters, the young cats are just looking like, okay, what's gonna happen? And they're just standing there like, all right. And then you have them taking too long to decide what they're gonna do. So Carmichael is like, look, y'all need to hurry up and decide. Like, y'all gonna arrest us? If you're not, y'all need to get on, right? And these deputies, they're like, oh, I guess we gonna go, right? We don't know what to do. So then they take off. And this is this pivotal moment because
Yeah.
they would then report that as they began to canvass, doing that slow, hard work of introducing, getting webbed into the community, knocking on doors, they would, show up at a tenant farmer's home or a small landowner's home, and the word had already spread. And the response would always be, are you those freedom riders? Again, that language of freedom riders. They didn't say, were you in Are you those Snickers? Are you those NAA? They said, are you those freedom riders that told the police off, that cussed out the deputy sheriffs? And you can almost see the sort of that Cheshire cat grin
Yeah.
on the part of Stokely Carmichael saying, yeah, that was us, right? But that gave this sort of sense of, not being impervious to sort of fear, right? I mean, because it wasn't about they were fearless. It was like they weren't allowing, the fear to paralyze them. And by demonstrating that you could actually stand up for your rights and not be killed in a place like that, right? So it wasn't just being defiant and bold. It was that, okay, what's going to happen next? And then they're still around the next day and the day after that. It's showing that there's just a little bit of space, right, for you to do the work that needs to be done. And again, it's not about sort of eliminating fear because fear is important. That keeps you from doing stupid stuff, right? Like you got to have a rational, healthy fear of the danger and the consequences. But what it did was saying, okay, we're not going to let the fear paralyze us. It's still dangerous. It's still risky. We're going to make smart decisions, but we're going to act.
I
And
love that story.
Can I just
yeah,
mention that is so important because people assume either that we were afraid or that we were not afraid. I mean, yeah, we were afraid. I mean, and in fact, you stayed away from the people who were not afraid because they were crazy and they would get you killed because they would do stupid stuff, right? So it was so important to understand the main thing is you internalize the fear and you somehow don't let it stop you from doing it. And one of the things we always understood is if somebody is killed, 10 of us will come in their place because you never let violence stop the movement. You have to keep moving. But that was so important. Okay. Yeah.
and
Christina?
I was gonna add too, it's interesting as well when you think about, the risks that people took, just, walking up to the courthouse, right? Someone may snap your photo, your address will be found, in the newspaper for people to locate and find you. And thinking about the story of Fannie Lou Hamer, she goes back to the plantation and Mr. Marlowe's like, take your name off, don't do this anymore, or, he's going to have to fire her. And she chooses to leave the plantation. So also too, that economic risk as well, that I'm willing to go without a meager, even though it's a small income, I'm going to risk that income as well. So I think about too, one of the families I was looking at in Humphreys County, Aaron Hazelwood, he was a farm owner. And so he opens his home to these Freedom Summer volunteers. He's part of the movement and they began to freeze his credit, at the local bank. Right. And so there's this fear, there's these consequences that aren't just physical either, but these economic consequences that happen. But people, again, like Judy, you were saying, you have to look it in the face, not stand down and continue the movement on.
And that's if I could add real quick, Emily, that's such an important point. I'll just say this briefly that Christina just made about the risks that people were taking. Because often we'll look at those who are of some means, maybe a landowner, somebody had, they risk losing their land or having a loan called in or access to credit being denied. And then we'll look at sort of a tenant farmer or a sharecropper or a day laborer, and we'll say, the working poor, and we'll say, well, they were willing to go on the front lines because they didn't have anything to lose. But that's not the right thing because in
Yeah.
effect, they had more to lose because they could lose it all. Right. I mean, their
Mhm.
margins, what they were living on was so small
Yeah.
that, the consequences for these folk were extreme. There's nothing to fall back on. Right. You're literally at the mercy of, white folk in power. So that idea of, well, poor folk were willing to move because they didn't really have as much to lose materially. Yeah, but they had everything to lose because they had so little. And so I think that's an important part of that understanding, that dynamic of risk that really it applied to everybody.
Mhm. And even food as well, because thinking about a registrar telling a woman, oh, I can cut your food commodity surplus. Like, I can cut your access to food as well. And thinking about those moments.
Everything that everybody's been saying brings up so many stories and ideas. Sam Block, the sheriff, telling him, "I don't want to see you," and Sam's like, "You don't want to see me? You better pack up and leave." It's that same sort of idea, but it's not just the SNCC organizers too, right? And so Charles McLaurin, he describes the first time he takes some older ladies to register to vote. And they're driving past places where people have been lynched. They're driving past, a gas station that's known for beating up Black customers who stop there. And he's just getting more and more afraid. But when they get to the courthouse, the three older ladies that he's with, and he organized them, he tried to convince them to come. But when they get to the courthouse, they're the ones that get out of the car and just walk up the steps of the courthouse like they were born to it. And he's just like, and this is a young man who's been in the military. He said he was playing around with a gang in Jackson. And he's like, that's the day he became a man, was following these older ladies. And so I think that, and we could tell stories probably all day of similar kinds of incidents. And so I think SNCC opened up some space and inspired people, but local people also did that for SNCC. And I think, your story about Mrs. Hudson is similar with, Freedom Summer. But that you mentioned the commodities, right? Does somebody want to talk about when SNCC is organizing in Greenwood and the white power structure basically miscalculates? They decide to punish everybody by removing the commodities and, saying they're not going to distribute them. And they think that this is going to really shut down the movement, but instead SNCC uses it as an opportunity to show what they can do. Does anybody want to talk about that?
It sounds like you were about to do a very good
Sure.
job.
All right. All right. All right.
So we
Go
can.
for it.
Well, I'm relying here again on Charles Payne and John Dittmer and their research, but SNCC begins organizing in the Delta in summer of 1962. And, it's one or two people in this county and that county. And in Greenwood, in LaFleur County, where SNCC is organized, is based, sort of the central organizing space, the white power structure says, okay, we're going to stop handing out commodities. And this is what was used to provide food for people before food stamps. And it actually subsidized, it made it so that plantation owners didn't have to pay their labor enough to survive, because the federal government would pick up the slack and provide food when they weren't in the fields working. And so, they cut out they stopped providing the commodities. And SNCC, approaches it a couple of ways. One, they're dealing with the federal government, but in the meantime, they spread the word and they say, we need food, we need clothes, and they start bringing in supplies from all over the country. Ivanhoe Donaldson was a student at Michigan State, and he would drive truckloads of food from Michigan State to Clarksdale, Mississippi. One time he got arrested there and was in jail over Christmas. He talked to me about that one time. But SNCC essentially
could you mention that the reason he gets arrested is because they have also, since Black folks didn't have any access to, drugstores or pharmacies or whatever. So he and one of his classmates is coming from Michigan State with, aspirin and over-the-counter, pharmaceuticals, not drugs, pharmaceuticals, and he gets arrested for transporting drugs. Yes.
Well, and I think he said he didn't even know what was in there, but it was like just a first aid kit. They're just looking for some excuse, right? But what ends up happening is SNCC is able to bring in food and clothes and build these connections. And so it shows that they actually have resources and that they're not going to abandon people. And so some people who might be afraid to register to vote will come and help distribute food and clothes to their neighbors. So it ends up, giving SNCC more organizing opportunities and more ways of showing that they have connections and that they're not going to leave people, to suffer the consequences on their own. And I think that that's, I think that kind of organizing often is just so invisible in our histories, where we're just focused on the big events.
It also talks about, goes to the point that it's not just about voter registration or getting farm loans for people. It is the sense that you have to take care of basic needs. That if people don't have clothes and they don't have food, that is one of the things that you have to deal with. And I remember one of the younger Black activists asking us, well, what was the agenda that you went into a community with? What did you take in with you? And I said, we didn't have an agenda when we came in. We had voting rights, of course, but other than that, what we're doing is listening to people to say, what do you want? What do you think is most important, the most important need in your community? And that listening was really important for folks. We're not deciding before we go in. We're asking folks, what do you want?
So Judy, go ahead, Christina.
No, I was also going to talk too from that point as well as thinking about listening. SNCC also made a point to listen to children. I don't know if we wanted to go into age just yet.
Sure, go for it. Yeah, go for it, please.
It made me think about too the importance of addressing people's basic needs and thinking about looking at the Freedom School curriculum. One of the things they used was the world around them for the children as well. Look at white schools and look at the Black schools you're in, and children are already recognizing there's a difference, there's inequality. I lack these rights, or I lack these basic needs too. And I also think about as well the importance of children in the sense with Macomb in 1961 with young girls like Brenda Travis as well, and her talking about too, learning about the murder of Emmett Till and so many children seeing the Jet magazine circulate around. And I think it's Joyce Ladner who talks about the Emmett Till generation as well, that children are beginning to understand that this can and could happen to me. And that they want to then use that to mobilize themselves for a better future for themselves and the people in their community around them. But yeah, thinking about age and listening, and that SNCC and this grassroots tradition also, provided a platform for children to organize and to learn how to organize as well.
And, if I could add, just thinking about some of the continuities and parallels, when we think about SNCC organizing around commodities, right? I mean, and Judy, your point is well made that, they're like, okay, we have an idea of what we may want to do. The vote is important, but we're going to go in, we're going to listen to the people. What is it that they need? What is it that they want that animates them, right? To get them excited and to get them involved. And then out of nowhere, Emily, as you said, this effort to sort of crush the movement and to hurt, to really punish people creates an opportunity. But there always seems to be a desire, a need to meet the basic needs of people in this country, right? In sort of Western development world. But this is a constant thing. So, fast forward, 4 or 5 years, and you have what? In Oakland, California, the newly formed Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, one of the first things they do is they create survival programs, right? Free breakfast for children, again, connecting with the children, but also meeting the material needs of people, a free health clinic. I mean, these are extensions. And if you look, that's moving forward in time. But if you move back in time, you had in the African American community, we don't talk about it in terms of like a movement in civil rights per se, but it belongs on that continuum of the Black freedom struggle. And that is the sort of the missionary and benevolent societies that are constantly providing for the material needs of society when of the Black community, when the government, in the absence of a social safety net, is failing to meet its obligations to its citizens. And it's not a surprise, I would say, even today in this very moment, that we see issues that are animating people today in 2025 and in 2026 around affordability and around access to healthcare, being able to afford healthcare, around sort of the price of groceries. I mean, like, these are basic fundamentals, and I think you can draw a straight line all the way through when we're talking about this American project and democracy.
Yeah. Can I add
Absolutely.
that? All of this is so important. But I also wanted to just piggyback on something that you said, Christina, in terms of the curriculum of the Freedom Schools. And of course, the Freedom Schools was a project that Charlie Cobb, SNCC's Charlie Cobb, field secretary in the Delta, that he came up with, because he had come from a long line of Black educators, right? And so he comes up with this idea, and then they develop a curriculum. But one thing that really struck me, aside from the libraries and, through our networks, and we can talk about the national office at some point, but the networks that we develop, books are going down into these libraries. Um, uh, but what I always think about is, at some point I read about the fact that some of the freedom schools were actually looking at the Mississippi State Constitution, right? And they're looking at it, and the teacher's saying, well, look at this phrase. Does this phrase help you or your people? Now, this is a Mississippi State Constitution developed by total white supremacists who really only want to keep, basically, they want to put, Black folks back in enslavement. But so they're looking at this Constitution, and what the teacher is saying is, okay, does this phrase apply to you? Does it help you? Does it even help your poor white neighbors who may be living next door to you? Okay, if you wanted to do a new state constitution, how would you change that? What other kind of wording would you do? What would you put in this constitution that would actually benefit Black folks, poor people, and so part of what the schools were doing, they're not only talking about, Paul Laurence Dunbar and, Claude McKay and stuff, they're also suggesting that the young people question what exists and what should it be. So this is what is now, but what could it be if we work toward it? And that sense of questioning, I think, was really key in those freedom schools.
When we get a little bit further, we're going to talk about some of our efforts to document this history and share it. And one of the things, we've got a toolkit on the freedom schools, and it points people towards, there was a gathering of freedom school students in Meridian, Mississippi at the end of Freedom Summer, and they put together their own platform of what they would like to see. And, it's a remarkable document. And to me, and this really speaks to what Hasan was just talking about, what's really sad is how much they were calling for is still relevant today. But it's a remarkable document that speaks to what you were just talking about, both of you, all three of you, about the sort of material needs, but also the way that the young people were questioning and thinking and really laying out a vision for our country, for themselves and our country, that we would all benefit from today. Judy, you mentioned the SNCC National Office. We've talked a lot about SNCC's work in the field, but another thing that I think people don't understand about the movement is that when you've got people out in the field, that there is, at least with SNCC, this really important infrastructure and bureaucracy even that supports that work. SNCC had a research department, photographers, it had communications. I mean, it was a very extensive support system for people working in the field. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's really my first contact with SNCC as an organization, because I come out of college. I think I'm taking 6 months off, and that I'm going to be working on the Eastern Shore with Judy Richardson and the Cambridge movement. And so the field secretary, Reggie Robinson, says, "Oh, I'm going to go down, visit the office, come down, and we'll come right back to Cambridge." So I go down. Now, first of all, as you said, SNCC, it needs an office that can coordinate and support the activities that are being organized in projects in Mississippi, Alabama, Southwest Georgia, and Arkansas. And so that office is a national office in Atlanta, and not far from the five Black colleges in the Atlanta University system. So I first see that national office in '63, and I go down, and when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, oh, we're going to see rugs on the floor, right? It's going to be spacious, maybe Urban League or something, halfway luxurious, right? We turn off onto the side street. It's above a beauty parlor near that, Atlanta 5 campuses. And the first image I see is this glass door. And I see the glass door, and then there's stairs leading up to the office. And I see this man sweeping the stairs, and Reggie runs up the stairs, and they hug like long lost brothers, right? I'm thinking, whoa, SNCC is so egalitarian, right? Because I'm assuming that Reggie is hugging the janitor. And then I hear Reggie calling the man's name, and he says Foreman. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is Jim Foreman, SNCC's larger than life executive secretary. And And in fact, Foreman is the one who really built this national office and the structure for it. And so Foreman, and a lot of SNCC people will tell you the story of Foreman sweeping the office, okay, and then giving them the broom and saying, you sweep the office, okay. And so Foreman often swept the office, but what he's saying with this is that, because he really wasn't that good at it, but anyway, is that every job is important to the organization, and that no one's too important to do any of these jobs, right? So I come in, and I remember coming into this office, and it's like this beehive of activity. It looks like organized chaos, right? And so I'm seeing young people my age, they're strategizing, they're doing this. And a major part of the national office, the role of the national office was to develop networks that would support the work in all our projects. So I come up, I see in front of me this bank of two operators running what's called the WATS line, the Wide Area Telephone Service, WATS. It's like an 800 line, right? And so, for example, if Mary Lane, the local SNCC organizer, got in jail in Greenwood, Mississippi, our Greenwood field office would call the Atlanta office. And then our Atlanta office would then call a network in the Friends of SNCC organization all over the country, right? So, for example, Mrs. Mildred Shaw, middle-class Black woman on the south side of Chicago. And they would say, Mrs. Shaw, Mary Lane's in jail in Greenwood, Mississippi, you got to call the sheriff, okay? And so either we would have the number of the jail, or we would have, if we were lucky, the home number, which is probably on a party line, which nobody knows anymore, but anyway, a line for their home. And she would then call. And she had one of those really commanding voices. And she would say, we know you have Mary Lane in your jail, and she better come out the same way she went in. Because, of course, a lot of Black folks would go into these jails and never come back out again. So I see also off into a corner, I see Ruby Doris Smith, right? She's the office administrator. And a lot of people will tell you, Foreman may have been the executive secretary, but it was Ruby who ran that office, right? And she was so respected. And some SNCC folks have called her the general, right? Spelman student, came out of the Atlanta student movement, had been at that original organizing conference in 1960 for SNCC, had done 40 days of hard time in Parchment Prison during the Freedom Rides, 30 days on the chain gang in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And you mentioned Ivanhoe earlier. Ivanhoe once told me that when he was in jail in Mississippi, he said he actually got a letter from Ruby Doris every day. And I said, how'd she get it to him? He said, well, they were trustees. He said, she wanted me to know that somebody in the national office, most particularly Ruby, knew he was there and was going to stay in touch until they got him out of there. So that was immediately. I would see Jack Minnis. He's in a little side office, and this is this crusty older white guy who could get research from a stone, right? He's head of research. This is before internet, Google, Wikipedia, nothing, right? And there's a wonderful thing, which I will just show because I don't think we have a thing of it, but there is a research document that he did, and it's called Chronology Mississippi, and it's a chronology of violence and intimidation in Mississippi. And it's a chronology of all those Watts line, 800 reports, because Summer 64 were giving out press packets because all these press people are following the 700 some, white students who are coming to work on 1964 Freedom Summer. But we want the press to know that these individual sheriffs, it's the Thompson tank that Mayor Thompson, has put in the town in the middle of Jackson, Mississippi, right? That it's not just because this is, some errant, as the northern media would consider it, some redneck sheriff, right? We want them to know that what they're seeing with this violence and intimidation is part of a general systemic violence and intimidation, right? And so we have just pages and pages of photos from our photo department, from this is Jimmy Travis, right? And he had been shot in the shoulder and the neck when he was doing voter registration work, and we thought we were going to lose him. So it's making it personal, but it's also somebody in research. I know, for example, when we were doing that photo of me on the Toddle House sit-in, for example, and all the others, it's Minnis who says we need to buy stock in Toddle House. And we end up sending Bobby Yancey, who later goes into the Schomburg Center, Bobby Yancey and Dick Gregory, the comedian Dick Gregory, his wife Lillian, the two of them go up to a stockholder meeting to say, why are you still segregating your, restaurants in Atlanta, right? Always the sense was that it was the larger issue. It wasn't just this individual restaurant. And okay, so I see the research. I see Julian Bond, who later becomes, of course, head of the NAACP chair. And he'd been a leader in the Atlanta student movement. And he's typing on two fingers. And he's talking to the Black press. He's talking to some of the traditional white press. What we're trying to do is to claim the narrative. How do you frame the narrative about our work? And so we do this through the student voice that we send out to the network of student campus friends of SNCC, UC Berkeley, NYU, University of Chicago, wherever. And then that's photos, it's reports from the field. We have the staff photographer, as you mentioned, Danny Lyon. He'd come down from University of Chicago, now a very famous photojournalist. I see Tomio Wakayama, Japanese Canadian, also a staff photographer. And during World War II, he'd been sent with his family to a Japanese internment camp in Canada. So we had a print shop, right? We owned our own printing press to get out leaflets because we didn't want to have to depend on anybody who could maybe stop the presses because they didn't like what we were doing, in our work. And so all of that, though, we had the Freedom Singers. A lot of people know Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagan, founder of Sweet Honey in the Rock, one of the SNCC Freedom Singers. All of this is to say that we depended on networks. And it's one of the things that Ms. Baker really emphasized with us. She gives us not only contacts, but she also gives us her networks and that sense that you had to develop people who could get the message out.
I think soon we're going to kind of make a transition and talk about some of the work we've done together and individually to document this history and share it. But before we make that transition, Hasan, I know that we've talked a lot about SNCC's voter registration work, but you've studied Lowndes County, where SNCC is actually able to implement, they get the right to vote after the Voting Rights Act. And SNCC says, now that we have the right to vote, what can we do with it? And Lowndes County, I think, provides, we've talked about continuities between the past and the present. It seems to me that Lowndes County offers a model that we would do well to pay attention to today. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Lowndes County definitely offers a model, not just a model. Sometimes that model gets reduced to the creation of third parties, right? And well, you did something like that in Mississippi, you did something like that in Lowndes County, Alabama. We need to create our own third party. I mean, the reason why they created a third party in Lowndes County, Alabama, is because Jack Minnis, found an obscure law that was on the books from the post-Reconstruction era that was designed to re-empower white supremacists that said any county in the state of Alabama as a state law could create their own independent political party to challenge the power of that black and tan Republican coalition, because Democrats were essentially often, sort of in exile, if you will. And all they had to do was create meet certain criteria. And so it was a structural thing that allowed for the creation of a third party. But what's more important than that is the kind of politics that went into the that went into the new party, small d democratic politics. And that's the real lesson that should come out of Lowndes County, not the structural stuff, right? But the idea of why did they feel it was necessary to create this particular structure in this particular place at that particular moment in time. And that small d democratic politics is really the application of Ella Baker's organizing philosophy towards electoral politics, saying wealth, whiteness, and previous previous political experience are not going to be prerequisites for holding office. I mean, that's the new kind of democratic politics, political engagement that is fundamentally un-American, that is woven into the creation of this new political party. So, it's nice even in the moment to talk about, hey, we're going to create our own third party. I don't care what if it's a third party or what's in an existing two party. The idea is, what's the culture? What's the political culture that you're going to create? And in addition to that is the sense of accountability. So they're creating, I mean, so what's so beautiful about what happens in Lowndes County, and there's certainly it's echoes of what we saw in Mississippi, but it's really concentrated because it's coming directly out of the movement, and it's saying, look, we got to create this new political culture, this new political environment, is that candidates were actually irrelevant. So now we have it flipped, right? Where it's all about charisma. And you can see the influence of Ella Baker, right? We get so caught up with the charismatic politician and elected official. And rather than saying, and this is what we saw in Lowndes County, that the candidate is actually irrelevant, because the candidate is going to be one of us. So no matter who it is, they're going to be beholden to us, and we're going to hold them accountable. So it really doesn't matter who it is, because that's our person, and they're going to do what the people need them to do. So now we have it flipped, right? We get the person who can speak well, who looks good, who can crack a joke, and this, that, and the other, and we don't take into serious consideration their accountability to us and our willingness as people to hold them accountable. So a lot can be learned from both Mississippi and then, of course, in Alabama, about how we should be engaging in politics beyond the structural stuff, which is nice, but how do we engage in the politics that will actually lead to freedom?
It seems to me one of the things that's really remarkable about Lowndes is the extent of the political education that SNCC and local people engaged in.
Yeah, that's also one of the critical lessons, I think, that come out of the movement, that we've also lost, right? Like we've
Mhm.
become very good, and we've become experts across the political spectrum at voter mobilization, right? We can get anybody to the polls for almost any reason, but that wasn't the critical lesson that comes out of the movement. Comes out of the movement is that voter mobilization is actually less important than voter education, right? In fact, if you don't do the education part, then you can mobilize anybody to vote for anything, right? But the whole idea was to get them to vote for the right thing. And so the political education, the voter education, is fundamental. And it's also something that, we've really gotten away from. And I mean, collectively, and it's something we've done it in the Black community, right? I mean, that's why you got so many people voting for the wrong people, right? Because we're living in this era of heightened misinformation and disinformation. So perhaps now, even now, more so than ever before, that emphasis on voter education is critically important, and it's one of the lessons that certainly we can draw from the work that SNCC did.
So, SNCC, Christina, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, just one point,
Yeah.
very small, but one of the things I love that one of the primary sources out of Lowndes County is the comic book that Cortland Cox and Jennifer Lawson. It goes back to voter education, where they were really tackling, people who may not be able to read or read well, to bring it in a comic book form, to know how the sheriff is selected, how local politics works. So I really get excited hearing you talk about that. And just that primary source that I utilize in the classroom, a lot of the comic books that were produced out.
And if you fast forward, I mean, the 21st century equivalent of that, I mean, the point that you just made of like, why do you use a comic book? One, because of the high rate of adult illiteracy, but it was also something that was accessible, right? It was a way to reach the people. When we think about social media today, it's just a tool, right? It's a
Yeah.
comic book, right? It's a way to reach the people that can
Mhm.
be harnessed, right? And you can't rely wholly on that. They weren't relying wholly on the comic books and saying, all right, we produced it, and therefore y'all are good. Like, no,
Exactly.
that's a way to inform. Then there's mass meetings, then there's meetings around it, there's workshops around it, right? And it's the same thing. Whatever it's social media today, it'll be something else tomorrow. It's the tool. That's just a tool, but we can't rely, we can't think, we can't act as though the tool is the end, right? And we
Right.
saw that with the comic
Yeah.
books. It's a tool that was a means to an end. And sometimes we forget what the end is, and sometimes we forget even
Yeah.
how to create the tool.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is really remarkable about SNCC, over and above everything we've already talked about, is the sense that so many people in SNCC had that they were making history. And of course, a lot of that starts with Jim Foreman, SNCC's executive secretary, and SNCC really documented its history in remarkable ways. The reports that SNCC people wrote in the field, and all the work that Judy was describing in the office. But SNCC people didn't stop with the history creation when they were in the heart of the movement, but have also had an intense interest over the subsequent years of how that history is told. And I could go on about some of that, but I want to zero in. After the SNCC 50th anniversary conference, a group of people that were part of working on that conference came together and organized the SNCC Legacy Project. And the SNCC Legacy Project has worked in partnership with many people, but including a group that is called the Movement History Initiative, or eventually was named the Movement History Initiative. And Hasan and I have been fortunate to work on that project for a number of years, and Thomas has been working on that more recently. But one of the things that we've been able to do through the Movement History Initiative and SNCC Legacy Project is create a website, the SNCC Digital Gateway, that tells the story of SNCC's history from the inside out and the bottom up. And we'll have some information on how people can access that website. But in addition, here's the homepage of that website. And then more recently, sort of building on that website and trying to take this history out into the community, we were able to get a grant through the National Endowment of the Humanities. Unfortunately, one of the last grants that the NEH gave in its recent, or its long-term format, and that was for a project called SNCC and Grassroots History, and it enabled us to host 6 gatherings at HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, 6 workshops at African American and civil rights museums, and also create a series of toolkits, 6 toolkits and an interpretive booklet that tell different parts of SNCC's history. And part of what made all of this possible is the incredible rich documentary resources and materials from SNCC. And so, Christina, do you want to talk about the archival work that you've done and what you think is important about SNCC's archives?
Yes, yeah. It's funny too. I was with SNCC veteran Fred Mangrum. He came out of Howard with NAG down to Mississippi. He was in town.
NAG being the Nonviolent Action Group, the SNCC affiliate at Howard University.
Yes. And I remember taking him into the state archives of Mississippi, and he was just shocked because he said, he was like, when we were in Mississippi, and he later works with Head Start, he was like, I wasn't worried about keeping the records. I was worried about surviving, getting funded, getting the people access to resources. And so I think, there's a beauty too when Judy was talking about SNCC had a job for everyone, the photographers documenting what was going on, the people in communications departments documenting what's going on, the Watts line being 24/7 and people typing and sending these reports off as well, that you can read today online, whether it's through SNCC Digital or the Wisconsin Digital Collection, which I know is down, but it's coming back up in next spring. But then also CRM that as well, that was done by the Bay Area Friends of SNCC, of people wanting for the materials to be engaged with, used in the classroom. And I think, like Hasan was saying, the connections people can make from the past to the present as well. And for me, it's been, very important to work with SNCC veterans too, particularly someone I've been working with for the last 2 years, Jan Hilligus, and digitizing the collection that she has gathered and amassed over the years, over the last 60 years too, particularly starting with the records from the COFO office and the stories these tell, reading and looking at the Freedom Summer applications too. And then, all this to say, bringing these materials into the classrooms, whether it is the university classroom or a prison school that I also work in as well, for students to read and learn these histories not only through the documents, but through oral histories as well, through the Civil Rights History Project at the Library of Congress, and where people can, particularly students, they can read about a person, but then they can see them talk about that history, the emotions that are still captured as well, or even invite those speakers in. And so that's the beauty too of how much SNCC was documenting what was happening to use for these legal cases, to use to share with the Friends of SNCC networks as well, but how much this history has been preserved and how much people have still in their homes, in their attics, or in storage units today that are still being processed as well.
Could I just mention very quickly, I won't go on, the reason you have so much documentation is first, of course, because, Foreman is always saying, write it down, this is history, which none of us believe, but he did because he had been an historian, right? He had come out of studying history. But the other part is just really administrative. So you've got Ruby Doris sitting there saying, look, unless you give me a report about what you've been doing and any progress that you have made in your voter registration drive in whatever community, unless you give me a report about that, I'm not giving you any money. You're not going to get any more money. And so it was a very practical thing, or or I'm not going to give you a check to pay for the car that just broke down in the Sojourner motor fleet, because we had this motor fleet too. So it's both the thing of understanding, maybe we're making history, but it's also, you got to prove to me that we're paying you this little $10 a week, which was $9.64
payroll, yeah,
right? When we could get it to them, that you're going to give me something in return. You're not going to just be sitting in somebody's house and let them, feed you and stuff. And, maybe you're walking down somebody's dirt road, but then you're coming back again. I want to see what you're doing in that community. And so part of it is that, and it is always the sense that that you see now. And Emily, you are so right. I mean, all of you are so right that what we as SNCC people continue to do is to tell our own story. And so we're telling it back then, but we're also trying to tell it now. We're trying to tell what we actually experienced in our own words. And through you all, because you all are historians and you all know this history too.
I wanted to ask Christina, we talked about the Lowndes County comic book, right? And you were able to use that in a really, I think, very profound way with one of your students. Is that something you want to share?
Yeah, I can share definitely. And so in the classroom, particularly at the prison school I work with justice impacted youth, we're preparing them to do National History Day projects, and they were the first students from a correctional facility to ever participate in that. And so for one student, and there's many challenges in any classroom, but also concerning just reading levels as well. So it was hard to read documents, to, understand ideas. And so he quit the class. And luckily the principal, I didn't see him in class. I said, what happened? She was like, he quit the class, but she made him come back to me and tell me face to face why he quit the class. And he just said that his reading and writing wasn't strong. He didn't think he could produce a great project. And so we went through the SNCC toolkit we had in the classroom. It was the one on grassroots organizing. And I was talking to him about how they approached this in Lowndes County. And he was able to look at the comic book. And he looked at me, he said, well, can I make a comic book? And I said, sure, you can make a comic book. And so what he was able to do was explore the history of civil rights in Yazoo City and kind of take these Watts reports and transform them, have someone read it to him, and then transform them into a comic book for his final project. And so again, these are like sort of the lessons and the primary sources that can be used in the classroom. And I think for him, it really allowed him to finish and participate in National History Day as well.
Hasan, do you have any thoughts on using these materials or the significance of SNCC's history today that, beyond what we've already talked about?
Yeah, no, I think using the materials are really important because they show that what SNCC did wasn't the result of just sort of spontaneity, right? There's a lot of planning, there's a lot of trial and error, there's a lot of drawing on things that worked and developing them, And that's really important. I mean, again, some of the stuff can, is sort of a blueprint for organizing and can be lifted, whole cloth and applied today. But some of the stuff needs to be translated, right, into sort of a contemporary moment. But it shows that this stuff just doesn't happen overnight. Like the work of SNCC, the success of SNCC in certain projects, the failures that occur are all part of the process. And so I think when you begin to sort of look at the different aspects of SNCC's history that have been preserved, we see that process, right? And process is so critically important, and it's also when it comes to social movement building and understanding social movements, and it's also one of the things that is overlooked, right? We want to look at the large scale march, or we want to look at somebody knocking on the door, but as Judy was pointing out, we don't necessarily want to look at the administrative aspects of stuff, right? And in today's moment, if we're sort of building movement stuff, you have to document, right? You have to do the same things today that somebody like James Foreman had that vision to say we had to do then. And just like the NAACP, right? I mean, they have one of the most voluminous sort of bodies of records because they're keeping track of stuff.
Yeah.
Because that is also part of the record, but it's also useful in real time because you're learning in real time, and that's really important. I think that the body, the corpus of materials that SNCC activists have preserved, that we're now collecting and sharing in these various capacities, is really, really useful, not just for documenting the past, but also for drawing lessons into the future.
I really appreciate that. And for me, one of the things, and this isn't so much the documents, but just teaching SNCC's history. And for me, one of the most important things about teaching my students about SNCC, or just anybody that I run into, even my family, different conversations I've had, is SNCC really helps us understand that anybody can make a difference, and that it really is up to all of us as individuals, but also working with other people. Like Ms. Baker in the speeches, it's not enough to just do it yourself. You have to reach out to your neighbors and your friends, but it is also your responsibility. And Judy, you say this really well and really often, that if you learn a history that's centered around Dr. King, then you wait around for Dr. King. But if you learn a history that's centered around SNCC and local people, you understand that it's everyday people. And if it's everyday people who did it then you can do it today. And I think that that's one of the most important lessons. I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to talk about some of the
But Emily,
materials. Go
can I add
for it, Hasan.
can I
Yeah,
add real quick, because
please.
this also comes across in the materials in the documented record, that it's not a lot of people, right?
Mhm.
SNCC is not a big organization, right? Even when it sort of balloons in size, right, it's just a couple of hundred. That's max, right? So for the most part, we're talking about just dozens, scores that are sort of working a particular moment in time. I remember listening. I remember teaching to the civil rights class here at Ohio State, the Ohio State University, very good students, but they're just like everybody else. And I'm listening to the student, and I had to pause the student. I said, we were talking about sort of March on Washington for some reason. And I said, wait a minute, how many people do you think were at the March on Washington? And straight face, he said, everybody. And I was like, everybody? Like, I mean, he was like, everybody, like every black person in America was at the March on Washington. And so it's this idea that more people participated in the movement than actually did, right? I
Mm,
mean, if you got 10% in a county or a place to be really, really engaged, I mean, that was a major success. And that's an important lesson, because
Yeah.
what we should take away from that, and what's clear in the materials, is that it doesn't take a lot of people to make a big difference. So not only can sort of people make a difference, but not a lot of people. And that works
Yeah.
both ways. Doesn't take a lot of people to act crazy to shift the politics in a particular
Yeah.
way on a negative side. But the same applies when you think of the bombs of liberty and all those issues. Right? That's not a lot of people. It's just people making a lot of noise who got to organize and some financing. But on our side, it also doesn't take a lot of people, but it takes committed people who understand and are learning and are willing to listen to everyday people to make a big difference. So I think that's one of the things that comes across too in a documented record.
good.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted to just mention a little bit more about the toolkit materials, and I think we're going to have some slides that show them and how to access them. So SNCC the project has created these 6 toolkits, and there's one more in the works on direct action. And as you can see, there's toolkits on art and culture, voting rights, Black power, freedom teaching, the organizing tradition, and women and gender. And then the SNCC and grassroots organizing interpretive booklet provides an overview and also includes primary sources with questions and annotations. The 6 toolkits and then the one on direct action that will join them, they all use storytelling to talk about these aspects of SNCC's history. They have exercises that connect the toolkits to the SNCC Digital Gateway. They have they have exercises involving document analysis and connect to additional resources. So they're designed to work with the SNCC Digital Gateway. They're wonderful resources for classrooms, but also for anyone interested in the history or for organizing. The SNCC Legacy
I'm sorry,
Project.
before you get to that, because you also mentioned that they are all free.
Thank you. That was in my head and then it left. They are free. They are available to download. You can print them. You can post them. We want them to be used. They are available. Thank you, Judy. That's really important. There's a couple of different websites where you can find them, the movementhistoryinitiative.org and also the SNCCLegacyProject.org. And the SNCC Legacy Project website also has many other resources and materials, including recordings of SNCC veterans and historians in conversation as part of this project. So that's my 2 cents on the materials. Does anybody have any final thoughts on SNCC's history or the materials or the documentation?
Could I just say one last thing? Because I was glad you mentioned that, it takes all of us. But, one of the things that I got from SNCC, I mean, the people I'm with on the SNCC Legacy Project, I've known them for 65 years now. Right? We're all in our 70s and 80s. Every 2 weeks, I talk with 3 of them, 2 of them. I just saw another one at a meeting, I mean, we're not sitting around knitting baby booties, maybe doing that too, but not just that. So we are still involved in the world and we still understand that we have a responsibility to do something, whatever it is within our capability, right? But the point is that if you do nothing, nothing changes. So what you have to do is make sure that you're not around a lot of people who are saying, oh, ain't nothing going to change. It will never change. It's always been like this. Why are you even doing this? Stay away from those people. So you have to keep around people who really do believe that you have to do something, whatever that thing is. Because particularly now, we in some deep stuff.
SNCC people model the idea that if you believe in something and go out and do it, you have a pretty good chance of making something happen. It may not be everything you want, but you might as well get out there and try. And I think that's one of the things I've learned from SNCC.
Does anybody else have parting words?
No, y'all said it all. I mean, I think you brought it home in a wonderful way. So no, I agree. That's my parting words. I agree.
I hope that other people will learn more about SNCC and its incredibly rich history and find ways to carry that legacy forward.
And this has been such fun. I have so enjoyed it. So I hope people watching it also enjoyed it as much as we did doing it.
Yeah.